What is up, everyone? Prometheus here. Welcome back to my series an ongoing series where I talk about Sergei Bondarchuk's War and Peace. So today I'm talking about this is part two. That part one was the introduction. Part two is the history behind this movie. And when I say history, I mean like the production, but also kind of the historical events that led up to it, including the Napoleonic War and, of course, the French Revolution, because if you watched the first video, it did cut off while I was trying to talk because I ran out of time. But I was going to say, I'm French, so of course I have to talk about the French Revolution at some point on this channel. But here we are. I have part one of the movie pulled up on YouTube. So the YouTube channel, it was uploaded to the Mosfilm YouTube channel. So I believe that's the company that made this movie. So thank you Mosfilm for uploading the movie to YouTube. Then I'll be able to kind of find certain scenes, certain shots from the movie to kind of reference here and there, including some of the big battles later in the movie. So really, this film was made by the Soviets. It's a Soviet movie, and but my goodness, why don't they make movies that much today? But really, what it was is that the people in the Soviet Union were seeing all the success of the American Hollywood movies coming to the Soviet Union. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to create a movie to prove to the American Hollywood that they are also capable of creating movies, to kind of combat with the Hollywood, with the influx of great Hollywood movies coming to Soviet. They wanted to prove themselves that they could also be capable filmmakers. And through the support of the Soviet government, they were able to put together this movie, and it was, at the time, $100 million. Today, it would probably be like over $1 billion for sure. So they made the film with the goal to kind of prove themselves to match the success of kind of the American Hollywood. And when they released this film, they didn't just prove themselves. They more than proved themselves, and they didn't just match the greatness of American Hollywood movies. No, they transcended it. They with this movie, they more than proved themselves. They surpassed all American films before, since they did just surpass the entirety of American Hollywood through this film. They were able to surpass the entire art form of film and gave us the greatest movie we will ever get. And anyone who watches this movie can definitely see how it just absolutely puts the American Hollywood to shame. Not only the American Hollywood films at the time that kind of drove them to make this, but also modern Hollywood. Like, no film before or since has matched the scale of this one. So, behind the scenes, it was like an insane production, the film. There were thousands of actors, tens of thousands of actors, 300 of them being prominent characters in the movie, while over like tens of thousands of other actors being in the large battle scenes and large, like, just people in the background. Like, it was all real. There were over 100 filming sets across Russia, and they used real artillery. Like I mentioned in the previous video, they used real artillery behind the scenes. They used real cannons, and I would be surprised if people got injured on the set of this movie, because it was absolutely enormous. So, to pull up a scene that kind of proves my point about the battle sequences, right here, you can see that all of that is real. And filmmakers today just can't recreate something like this. So, see, real cannons. Those aren't special effects cannons. Those are real cannons, and wearing the Napoleon hat. But my point is, they used real cannons. They didn't use prop cannons. They didn't use CGI like they would today. No, they used real cannons. So as you can see, these battle sequences, all of those real people, the some of the battle scenes in this movie is absolutely grand. So, I think that's Napoleon. I don't know. So it's absolutely just stunning. See, all of that is real. And this film is pretty high quality. For something that was released in the 1960s, it feels pretty modern. Now, see that shot? That shot is on the... I believe they strapped a camera to the horse. There's many different techniques. They fired real cannons to the people, and see, that's an amazing technique what they used. It's kind of a first-person point of view. And it's just... See, all real. All of those real people. Do you see people making films like this today? No. So, see, all of those were real actors. All of that was... They fired real cannons and very convincing battle sequences. It's as if we're watching... It's as if we're watching real-life battle sequences. Like, if there was a... They just took a cameraman and plopped him right into in the center of the Napoleonic War, and he recorded it. They wanted to prove them. They see that the Soviets really proved themselves with this film, surpassing American filmmaking with it. So, right in the opening of the scene, you see a large... Looks like a drone shot, but they didn't have drones back then. I don't actually know what they used for this shot, but it's a large shot of the landscape, and that's just absolutely stunning. Now, we can pull off today, but people would just rather use CGI for that. And as you can see, that's a beautiful shot of the Russian countryside. So, 10 years prior to this film, there was also War and Peace, made by the Americans, and it didn't do really well critically. But then this film perfectly adapts the book, whereas this one, it failed in certain aspects in adapting the book, but this one just perfectly adapts the story, the tone of the Napoleonic War, which before the Napoleonic War, there was the French Revolution. The French Revolution it started because there were 3 estates in France at the time. They were still using the feudal system. And what they did is there was 3 estates. There was one, the king, and below them was the 3 estates. There was one, the first estate, which was the clergy, the church. Below them was the nobles, the rich people, the ones that didn't really need the ones that didn't pay taxes, and right below them was everyone else, the peasants, the workers, the ones that did get taxed. Now, one of the main reasons why this revolt happened was because, well, the peasants were tired of working and being taxed all the time by the king and by the nobles and the higher ups, while the rich, they didn't need to get taxed at all. So, of course, they were that revolution, that's one of the main causes of it. In May 1789, there was the meeting of the Estates General, which was the first time they had been called in over 100 years. King Louis called them, and they brought a list of their problems, their complaints, but there was little settled there. Little was settled in that. And King Louis, we all know what happened to him and his wife. But eventually, yeah, I got my history book right there. But eventually, there was also the storming of the Bastille, which was a large royal prison by the peasants, and they stormed that on July 14th, 1789. Eventually, August 4th, 1789 was the abolition of the feudal system, the system that they'd had for many, many years. The National Assembly did abolish it, and they abolished the Estates General, and there was eventually legislative power restored to France. Now, the eventual later in the August of 1789, there's also the creation of the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen in France, after the abolition of the feudal system, which had been governing them for many, many years. Now people had their rights. passed down by the Legislative Assembly, the National Assembly, and individuals have rights. They guiding democratic principles. So eventually, later in October of 1789, that same year, there was also eventually the March of Versailles, where several thousand people marched to Versailles to protest the high price of bread. Honestly, I don't blame them. I love bread. Eventually, the protesters did discover the plans of the royal family to flee France, and they forced the king and family to return to Paris, showing that the people did have power over the king, even though the king had governed them for years. And the the king had less of an opportunity to escape his country, and he found himself in some deep water with the people because of that, and wasn't looking pretty good for Louis, which, yes, we all know, eventually him and Marie Antoinette had their heads off with their heads. You know what happens. France used the guillotine all the time. Thank goodness they don't use the guillotine anymore. In fact, I don't think they execute people at all, but France today, people keep on making memes to delete France from existence. France is a pretty nice country, don't get me wrong. It's not a perfect country, but it's a nice country. Though if you were living in it during the French Revolution, then yes, I can understand you not really liking it. But the events eventually in 1790, a year later, there was the creation of the constitutional monarchy. They had a constitution, and the assembly wrote a new constitution for France that kept the country a monarchy, but transformed the distribution of political powers. It proclaimed France a sovereign nation, and made all government officials subject to the law. So, no matter how high up you were still subject to the law. They also dissolved the royal administration, and the shifted power from Paris to 83 individual districts. So Paris was divided into 83 districts. That seems like a lot. And it also limited the powers of the king and gave most of the powers to the elective legislative. So the king, like King basically today, like a president or something, but the King Louis, had less power, and that was kind of mainly because he was not a good king. He did a lot of stuff that really, really pissed off the French people, but eventually he lost a lot of his power, and most of the power went to the elective legislative. There was also the elimination of nobility as a legally defined class, the granting of same civil rights to all citizens, so all people were equal, finally, and the incorporation of church within the state, stripping clergy of their property and special rights. So, the feudal system was gone, and France was seeming like it was looking towards a good future, but that was far from the truth, because eventually France found themselves in some deep crap once again. So, what does this have to do with War and Peace? Well, the story is kind of inspired by the Napoleonic War, the Napoleonic War the events leading up to it included the French Revolution, which was one of the most important moments in human history. So, how do you incorporate? Well, Tolstoy did a lot of studying on what happened in Russia during the Napoleonic War. I would honestly take a movie like this about the French Revolution as well. Like, sure, this movie, best film I have ever seen, best movie, grandest movie of all time, largest production of all time. Like, no film is ever going to match the scale of this film, ever. But the historical aspects of it are also a great part. Because the Napoleonic War, the French Revolution were the events that caused the Napoleonic War, eventually led to the Napoleonic War. So, in France, about 1790 to 1793, which was nearing the 1800s, there was also the eventual emergence of the Jacobins and Girondins, or however you pronounce it. I'm French, but I don't know how to pronounce a French word. Who knows? Well, I'm part French. Whatever. But yeah, between 1790 and 1793, two different political groups emerged: the Jacobins and the Girondins. I'm just gonna call them Girondins. So the Girondins were moderates who wanted to maintain the monarchy, while the Jacobins were radicals who wanted to establish France as a republic. So they had different views, and that's probably gonna lead to conflict between them. So conflict there was. The Jacobins stormed the Tuileries Palace, in August of 1792, where the royal family was, and the king was suspended from his duties by the elective legislative assembly. So he was completely out of power at this point. He did not, he wasn't no longer had power. He was out of his power. And there was a government. It was more of a government, something we'd see today. But there was also a lot more conflict, and that didn't go well, because eventually, April 1792, France declared war on Austria. And when I was younger, I used to think, when I said Austria, they used to say Australia. So I thought, oh, France declared war on Australia. I thought they hadn't even, nope, Austria is a country in Europe. I never knew about it until a few years ago. That is where the most evil man in history comes from. I'm not going to say his name because I don't want to get nerfed off YouTube. I don't even know I don't know. But with charges to political structure of France, with the changes to political structures of France, many nobles fled to Austria and Prussia, and attempted to mobilize foreign powers against the new government of France. So they fled to. So many of the people in France fled to Austria and Prussia. This threat of invasion led to the declaration of war on Austria in 1792, the beginning of a series of conflicts known as the French Revolutionary War. So the wars that led up to the Napoleonic War, and Napoleon was the most powerful French person to ever exist, even though he was a short king, but who cares, as well as one of the most powerful people to exist, period. Though the most powerful man to ever live is probably Genghis Khan, who I am very fascinated by the history of Mongolia, the Mongol Empire, greater than the Roman Empire, in fact. But Prussia, the largest of the German states, so Prussia was a German state. I thought it'd be associated with Russia, but actually Germany. And they joined the Austrians they supported the Austrians. They joined the Austrians against their battle with France just a few weeks later, after the war started. So yeah, with the Prussians on their side, you think, oh, they would crush France in this war. And in September 1792, the National Convention and Declaration of France as a Republic happened, and France became a republic, like the Jacobins wanted. So the Jacobins got what they wished for. They wanted France to become a republic. Well, it became a republic. The National Convention, comprising representatives from the Jacobins and Girondins, voted to remove the monarchy and establish a republic. So again, the king was out of power. So he was probably just going to live a normal, mundane life, or maybe he's still rich. He could still live. I don't know. But he couldn't live a life because just a few months later, in January of 1793, there was the trial and eventual execution of King Louis. So Louis was tried and found guilty of treason, betraying his country, by the new republic. He was sentenced to death, but his execution was not supported by all of France. Some people were against it. So King Louis was off with his head. He died. He was treason. He betrayed his country, the country that he once ruled. So this shows that even the most powerful people in a country, the king, even they couldn't last forever. They weren't like immune to the law. They weren't above the law, though they used to, but eventually eventually their kings are going to fall. I'm kind of losing words here because I'm more used to talking about movies, not history, though I do know a bit of history. But later, August of 1793, Levé and Massé I think I'm pronouncing that right, but facing a series of military losses against Austria, Prussia, and of course Great Britain, the British people, the government instituted a levée en masse, which is a mass conscription, to provide additional soldiers for France's military efforts. So a massive amount of people in France were forced to serve the army against their war against Austria, Prussia, and the British people, them and their beans and teeth. I mean, Britain's a nice country, don't get me wrong, but they were the largest empire in history because they were spanned over multiple continents. Though the largest contiguous land empire was, of course, the Mongol Empire, which dwarfs the size of the Roman Empire, which we all know what happened with the Roman Empire. It eventually had to fall. But so did the Mongol Empire, which lasted a lot less than the Roman Empire. So, October 1793, just a few months after the execution of her husband, Marie Antoinette eventually found her head also under the guillotine. And Marie Antoinette, she was also arrested and tried for a number of charges, including treason, and exactly like her husband, off with her head. And no, she did not say that. Actually, she did not say that famous line about cake before she died. So that was fabricated, or I don't know. But really, eventually, 1793 to 1794 was the year that the Reign of Terror happened, the Great Terror, which was just one of the worst years in French history. There was civil unrest across the country, so the revolutionary government, the National Convention, arrested and executed up to 40,000 people who were perceived as enemies of the Republic in what became the Reign of Terror. So 40,000 people who weren't confirmed, just suspected to be enemies to the state, enemies to the Republic. They were executed, off with their heads. So Marie Antoinette and Louis were not the last people to have their heads cut off by the guillotine. Nope, they were followed by up to 40,000 more people. And then that leads us to November 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte. The man that's tying into this film, but Napoleon Bonaparte did eventually lead a successful coup against the French Republic and became the leader of France. So the French Republic didn't last forever, and Napoleon was approached to organize a coup against the government in France, and his successful overthrow of the Directory led to new leadership by the organizers of the coup. So Abbé Sieyès and Roger Ducos, but Napoleon were the new leaders, but Napoleon had new ambitious plans. He manipulated the situation and was elected first consul, the new leader of France. So he was manipulative. He worked his way to the top. He was originally a general, and as history tells, he was also pretty short, but sometimes small but deadly, small but mighty. Like, he would be considered super short by today's standards, but back then he was still seen as a large figure, as seen when Napoleon created reforms in France from 1800 to 1804. As leader, Napoleon centralized administration of the government departments, created the school system and tax system, the Bank of France, and a set of civil laws. But he also implemented road and sewer systems, but he also implemented the Napoleonic Code. And Napoleonic Code, the civil laws set by Napoleon. Of course, it's going to be the Napoleonic Code. It's a code set by him. I'm overanalyzing this, aren't I? But Napoleon was honored throughout France and was an icon and a hero. Though to some, he was also a monster who killed millions of people. And I won't deny he did kill many, many people in the eventual war through the Napoleonic Wars. In 1804, Napoleon was declared Emperor of France. In success of reforming France and expanding French influence throughout the country made him very popular with the people. They voted overwhelmingly to make him consul for life. With that power, he was able to crown himself Emperor of France. So, yeah, he became Emperor of France. Not king, Emperor. And that made him the most powerful man in the entirety of French history. And from 1804 to 1814, the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon built his empire. During his reign, he expanded French control and influence beyond the country's borders, invading many countries across Europe, including Spain, some of the Scandinavian territories, and much was destroyed. Many people were killed, and he also tried invading Russia. And that leads us to the events of War and Peace. So the Napoleon's invasion of Russia is what inspired Tolstoy to write the story of War and Peace, and that is when this movie and the book is set, the Napoleonic Wars. Not in France, but in Russia. And the Soviets were the right people to make this movie because they're Russian. They were the ones that went through this war. So of course they have the best understanding of its history, and therefore they can be the ones that best depicts War and Peace. Not the Americans, the Soviets, the Russians, the ones who actually experienced the war itself. But so Napoleon did create one of the largest empires in European history. In human history, in fact, there were many assassination attempts and proposals to further solidify his portion as leader. The question of Napoleon's appointment as consul for life was put to the people of France, and 3,509,000 voted yes, out of a total of 3,580,000 votes cast. In 1804, the Constitution was rewritten. France was reinvented as an empire, and Napoleon Bonaparte, again, was crowned as emperor. This was before the Napoleonic War, but he placed his brothers on thrones of Spain and Kingdom of Italy, and married off his sisters to royal families. So he also had family. His brothers and sisters also got in on the action, and Napoleon's conquest and expansion served to spread new ideas associated with revolution throughout Europe. In particular, the Napoleonic Code, which became the basis for legal systems on many European countries. So Napoleon spread much influence across the continent and had great influence, including his code becoming the new basis for the legal systems. So there's that. But all kingdoms must fall, and in 1805 to 1814, Napoleon's empire was at war with the continental system. So he expanded his empire by claiming territories on behalf of France, but concerns about his expansion led to wars for most of his reign with coalitions of Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, and of course Russia. So, this is kind of what led to the Napoleonic War in Russia, which, again, this is when the events are set, and as you can see, there are many scenes that depict the battles that occurred, and they all are so very real. Like, sure, no one is actually killed in these scenes, but it is so convincing, it's done so well, and it's just absolutely amazing. But just this film, like, that history a lot of that history isn't even mentioned too much in the film, but I'm just saying that the events leading up to the events that inspired this film. So if it weren't for the French Revolution, we wouldn't have had the Napoleonic War, and if it weren't for the Napoleonic War, Leo Tolstoy would have never written War and Peace, and if Leo Tolstoy never written War and Peace, we wouldn't have this movie. So thanks to the French Revolution, this movie existed, and honestly, I would not have it any other way. There's so much more history to unpack, but if you want a bit of history on what happened during the Napoleonic War, a bit of insight happened during the Napoleon's invasion of Russia, watch this movie, because it is a great well, some of the people are fictional characters, but it is still a very accurate to the time of war. You know how it was in the time? So, yeah, this was around the time that America was already a nation, 1776. Surprised that this happened during the existence of America. Used to think they were under the British rule, but unfortunately they were not. But the French Revolution and the Napoleonic War, especially the invasion of Russia, are interesting things. And if they didn't happen, Tolstoy wouldn't have written his book, and this movie wouldn't have been made. So, I guess though those definitely weren't good events. They definitely killed millions of people and caused a lot of violence. A good thing that they did do is they did establish legal systems across the world from the Napoleon Code, and of course, War and Peace was written and eventually made into a movie, and that is this movie, the greatest of all time. And there's so much more to unpack. This is only part one. It's nearly 2.5 hours long. There's still parts 3, 4, 2, 3, and 4, and there's so many scenes. I'm going to be talking about cinematography next in the film, but for now, thank you for tuning into my next part of the War and Peace series. And again, don't get it confused with this one. This is the American one. I don't think the Russians liked this one, so they made their own. They looked at American cinema, they looked at this movie and said, yeah, no, we can do better than that. They didn't just do better, they transcended. They surpassed all filmmaking, all American filmmaking at the time, and set a high bar that no other film has ever been able to even come close to reaching. So, just kind of tying the French Revolution to this, thank you to the French Revolution for leading to the Napoleonic War and the eventual creation of this story. So, thank you very much for watching, and I will be back in episode 2 to talk about the cinematography of War and Peace. I will see you in the next one.